Hi, and welcome to our lecture on David Chalmers, the virtual and the real. In this essay, Chalmers defends a position he calls virtual realism, according to which virtual objects really exist. Events in virtual reality really take place. Our experiences of them are not just illusions, and they're just as valuable as non-virtual experiences. Chalmers is arguing against a position he calls virtual anti-realism, according to which virtual reality is a really second-class place involving objects that don't really exist, events that don't really take place, illusory experiences of things that don't really have value. The underlying metaphysics of Chalmers' position is something he calls virtual digitalism. According to this position, virtual objects really exist, and what they are fundamentally is digital objects. We'll see more about what that is in a moment. Events in virtual worlds are digital events. They really take place. Our experiences are non-illusory and they have value. Chalmers wants to defend this view, not only for all-encompassing digital realities like the Matrix, where you've been invaded for your whole life, say, but also for actually very temporary experiences with virtual reality that you might get from a 3D VR game. There are two meanings of the word virtual. Sometimes we use it to mean similar but not quite. So a virtual tie is not really a tie. Somebody actually was a little faster than the other racer, but it was close enough that we'll count it as a tie. Chalmers does not use virtual that way. He uses it to mean computer-based. A virtual reality has three key characteristics. It's immersive, interactive, and computer-generated. What makes virtual reality experience like the experience of ordinary reality? There are two key conditions. In the immersion condition, we feel surrounded by the virtual reality environment. We experience it from a certain perspective. We have multimodal sensory stimulation. The sights, the sounds, maybe the physical textures of the environment are present to us. This gives you a sense of being really present at a certain perspective in the environment. The second condition is interaction. So an environment is interactive when the actions by the user make a significant difference to what happens in the environment. What makes virtual reality virtual is that it's computer generated. It's grounded in some kind of computational process which generates inputs that are processed by your sensory organs. Virtual reality proper meets all three of these conditions, but you could consider looser notions of virtual reality that meet fewer conditions, also augmented reality that mixes physical and computer-generated elements. So we'll start by defining the notion of a virtual object. A virtual object is just the sort of thing that's contained in the virtual world and that you either perceive and interact with or you just seem to perceive and interact with when you're using virtual reality. So the classic virtual objects would be things like avatars, virtual buildings, weapons, treasures. Chalmers is about to give an argument that these things are in fact real, just as real as physical objects. Most philosophers don't think virtual objects are real. They subscribe to something Chalmers calls virtual fictionalism. So they think virtual worlds are fictional worlds. Virtual events don't really happen. They just happen in the fiction, the way it happens in the fiction that, Harry Potter goes to Hogwarts. Virtual experiences are illusory. They might have just a little bit of value, but it's the same kind of value that we have from engagement with fiction, from reading a novel or something like that. Chalmers thinks that this dismissive attitude towards virtual reality is driven by thinking of very simple video games. But virtual reality isn't restricted to gaming. You can also think of other kinds of applications of virtual reality, such as Second Life. If you meet a friend in Second Life and you have a long conversation, you want to say maybe that that's an event that really happened, and it might be an event that could have some kind of significance or value for you. Chalmers thinks actually even the kinds of interactions you have within video games are significant and meaningful and involve interactions with real objects. What are these real objects like? So Chalmers thinks virtual objects really exist. They exist in space, but only in virtual space. Virtual and physical spaces are distinct, but both are real. There's a structure, there's an order to the spatial organization of things, and the way things interact is determined in part by their locations in this space. What virtual objects ultimately are, including avatars as well as the items that they can pick up, what they ultimately are data structures. So these exist on the servers, for example, of an online game. These data structures can interact with each other. So there's some kind of data structure corresponding to your avatar in the game. There's some kind of data structure corresponding to the shopping bag. These things come together and they interact when your avatar picks up the shopping bag. Virtual objects have the causal powers of digital objects. So the data structure that corresponds to the shopping bag can have an impact on the way the data structure that corresponds to your avatar moves through the world, and vice versa. Because they have the causal powers of digital objects, that's what they are, according to Chalmers. The objects you perceive are whatever causes your perception. So if it's ultimately digital objects, like data structures on the game servers, that are causing you to perceive these virtual objects, then that's another reason why we can conclude that virtual objects are these data structures, these digital objects. The idea that you see the thing that causes your perception is not something that's restricted to virtual reality. So what are you seeing here, or who are you seeing? You want to say you're seeing Drake, right? The reason why that's the case is that Drake is the ultimate causal basis of the experience you're having right now. So there was, at some point, a photographer who stood in front of Drake, the man himself, took this picture, which went to the internet, which went to your instructor's computer desktop, which got uploaded into this video. There's a causal chain tracing back the experience that you're now having to this man at some point standing in front of a wall. And it's because your experience is ultimately causally anchored in that man. That's what's making your current perceptual experience count as an experience of Drake. This is called the causal theory of perception. If your experience in virtual reality is caused by a digital object, then what you're seeing is that digital object. You're actually seeing the data structure. Now, this might seem kind of weird. It can seem weird for a couple of reasons. Firstly, there you are in virtual reality and you're seeing some kind of dragon. You might think, dragons aren't real, so how could I be seeing a real object? And furthermore, what are data structures? There's sort of arrangements of code. What does it mean to say you're seeing a data structure? Data structures don't look like this creature on the right. Now, Chalmers wants to argue, actually, weirdly enough, you are seeing the data structure, and it's real. Here's how it goes. First, he's going to grant immediately that physical dragons aren't real, but virtual dragons could be. Now, if your worry is that this doesn't seem to look like a digital object, Chalmers is going to say, what did you think a digital object looked like? Now, you might have a visualization when somebody says digital object of some lines of code appearing on a monitor. But if you think harder about it, what you see on the monitor there, that's not the underlying digital structure either. That is something caused or generated in the graphic user interface of your computer. The code itself is something quite different, something that exists at a deeper level, something that's going to be there even if we unplug your monitor or switch it off. What do digital objects look like? You might think there's a gap between the way that they're presenting here and what they fundamentally are. But the first thing Chalmers does is he says, for physical objects too, there can be kind of interesting disparity between the real nature of the object and the way it shows up on the radar of consciousness. So if we think about distant stars, for example, these are huge flaming balls of gas, and they just appear as little pinpricks in the sky. What is tap water? It's H2O. Does this look like H2O to you? I don't know. Our ideas about what the underlying structure of the thing is and the way it meets the eye, those things seem like they can really come apart. Here's where the argument I think gets really interesting in this article. So Chalmers wants to say the virtual and the physical aren't really so different because virtual properties and events have effects on us that are similar to their physical counterparts. So the virtual apple that you encounter in the game has a bunch of effects on you. You see the redness, maybe you feel a certain texture. If you're in a good immersive virtual reality environment, you're going to have similar sensory experiences. But notice, the apple doesn't have that redness for you under all conditions, right? If you encounter the apple in the dark or at an enormous distance. It doesn't show up that way on your radar. You have to meet up with it in the right way to have the right kind of experiences with it. Exactly the same with the virtual object. The data structure that codes that apple is something that produces certain experiences in you, but only if you encounter it in the right way, only if your avatar is close enough to it, for example. So a digital structure can be virtually red or virtually square if it produces the right kind of experiences under normal VR conditions, just as physical objects are perceivably red or square if you encounter them under the right normal physical conditions. Digital objects exist in virtual space, and there can be many different virtual spaces. Those are functionally defined. So for some objects, there's no difference between a virtual X and an X. So Chalmers' examples are libraries and calculators. If you enter this virtual reality library, if it's detailed enough that you can have your avatar walk up to any book, see the title on the spine of the book, take that book down from the shelf, open it up, and then you can read the words on the page of that book, then this is a library for all normal purposes, right? Similarly with a calculator, if you have a calculator in your VR environment that has enough detail and structure in its underlying code that if your avatar presses the buttons, you get the calculations coming out correctly. If it's got that kind of data structure, then it just is a calculator. There's no difference between a virtual calculator and a physical calculator in that regard. So for anything where you've got what he calls an organizationally invariant property, you really collapse the difference between the virtual X and the physical X. If the property is something like being a calculator, whether something counts as a calculator depends only on the abstract causal organization of the underlying system. It doesn't matter whether your calculator has a plastic cover or an aluminum cover, or whether your calculator is something that you're using in virtual reality and is ultimately a data structure. As long as it performs the right computations, it is a calculator. For some objects, there's a genuine difference between the virtual X and the X. So virtual kittens are not kittens, but they are real, according to Chalmers. Now, you might wonder whether we perceive virtual kittens as having properties like softness, for example, which they don't really have, right? You might want to say, come on, data structures don't have soft fur. But Chalmers is actually going to say, no, our perception typically is not illusory here. The properties that we perceive these objects as having, the virtual kittens, those are properties that the object really does have, at least if you're a user who's aware that they're in virtual reality. If you have a case where somebody is, for example, drugged and their virtual reality helmet is put on them, they don't realize they've been placed into a VR environment and they encounter a very realistic kitten, that person could have an illusory experience because that person could take themselves to be encountering something that has properties of a real physical kitten. But as long as you know you're in VR, your experiences of the qualities of the objects that you encounter typically are not illusory. So Chalmers thinks that he's going to have to argue for this. And one of his most interesting arguments involves mirror images. So when you look at yourself in the mirror, are you seeing a part of reality, or are you seeing something that's actually an illusion? Maybe a very familiar illusion, right? There's this guy over there, but you're standing here. There's two of us. Something is unreal. Something's illusory. Something's not really there. Chalmers wants to argue that's the wrong way of figuring out what goes on in mirrors. And he thinks this is because we're cognitively oriented to the image in the mirror in a way that lets us use that mirror image as a guide to reality. And in particular, you're going to act in ways that reflect your knowledge that the mirror is a way of seeing yourself. So you can like put on makeup or shave or something like that, using the mirror image as seamlessly as a representation of yourself. Now, there could be some sort of weird cases in which you get tricked by a mirror that you didn't realize was there. So, there's some examples in the paper about somebody who's looking at something that's in fact a mirror, but they thought it was a window, and they get confused about what's there. But typically, as long as we're cognitively oriented to the situation, Mirrors don't produce an illusory experience, according to Chalmers. So you can be confused or misled by virtual reality if you don't know that you're in it, but ordinarily users are aware of the nature of their environment and they form appropriate beliefs about virtual objects. And in fact, seasoned virtual reality users can just perceive virtual objects as virtual, interacting with them seamlessly. So you know exactly how to make your avatar pick something up or interact with something. You don't have to think twice about it. And you don't get confused about how to interact with it. Now Chalmers takes up the example of Robert Nozick's classic thought experiment, the experience machine. This is a thought experiment which is supposed to make you feel that maybe virtual reality is problematic or disturbing, and the kinds of experiences you can have in virtual reality could not be as good as the real thing. So in Nozick's thought experiment, there's this experience machine that can give you any experience you desire. Never mind how, but neuropsychologists can stimulate your brain to make you think and feel that, you know, you're at the Met Gala or you're winning the Nobel Prize for Literature or making friends or reading interesting books. You can choose your experiences in advance. And what's actually going to happen is that you will be floating in a tank with a bunch of wires going into your head. And Nozick raises the question, if you were given this chance, would you plug into this machine for the rest of your life, pre-programming your life experiences? You can make them whatever you want. You could make them experiences of great pleasure or experiences of meaningful struggle. Maybe you'll be a starving artist. Maybe you'll be a movie star. You figure it out. And if you're worried that you won't be able to select adequate experiences, maybe there's going to be a team of experts or counselors who will give you some great ideas. Maybe every 2 years you can be fished out of the tank and given a chance to reset. But whatever you choose, you're going to have like a pre-programmed life let out for you in the machine. And while you're in the tank, you won't know that it's happening. You'll feel like it's real. You'll feel like you're really writing those poems or you're really at the Met Gala. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that other people can plug in as well. Maybe the robots will take care of us all while we're in the tank. So it's not like you have a moral duty to, provide food for your family or something like that. You can go into the tank. They can all have their tanks too. Nozick's question is, would you plug in? Do you think you would do that? Nozick thinks, of course not. We wouldn't do it because we care about the real world. We want to do things, not just have experiences. You don't want to just be sort of strapped down in the tank and, watching this first-person movie of yourself winning the Nobel Peace Prize. You want to actually accomplish something or achieve something. If everything's pre-programmed for you in advance, then you don't get to do things. You don't get to really be an agent. And Nozick thinks it's also very important to us to be a certain kind of person, not just to passively have experiences, even very pleasurable or meaningful experiences. And there's a limit on how meaningful the experiences in the experience machine could even be, Nozick thinks, because we want contact with a deeper reality, not just a human-made pseudo-environment. If Nozick is right, virtual reality seems like it's going to have to take second place. But Chalmers thinks, actually, the considerations that Nozick is bringing out with the experience machine, the first two don't really apply to good virtual reality systems. Because in good virtual reality systems, you're not just passively experiencing a pre-programmed course of life. You're actively intervening. You're making things happen. You're making choices which determine the way the virtual reality will go. If you make a speech in virtual reality, you have to actively think of what to say. You have to choose your words. You're not just getting this pre-programmed experience described in Nozick's thought experiment. You also have the chance in virtual reality to be a certain kind of person. You can be honest. You can be a liar. You can be a reliable friend if you're in a virtual reality environment. You actually have some agency within those contexts. As for number 3, Chalmers thinks it might be dubious. It's not clear that human-made environments are necessarily worse for us than physical nature. Chalmers now defends his theory of the value of VR experiences against a series of objections. The first has to do with relationships. You might sense that you'd be cut off from other people in virtual reality. Chalmers points out, of course, you can meet up with other people in VR situations. You can experience the same virtual reality environment with a bunch of your friends from the physical world, for example. You can also get to know new people who are in the VR situation. Another worry you might have about virtual reality is that your engagement with virtual reality would come at a cost to your life in the physical world. It could interfere with things that you enjoy in the physical world. Chalmers points out, of course, there's various types of activities and enterprises in the physical world already that can interfere with each other. So you could get into a job that takes up a lot of your time. If you're worried that, for example, fooling around with violence in VR could make you more violent in the physical world, there are parallel problems you might encounter with a job in which you had to be some kind of enforcer in the physical world. That could make you more violent outside your work life as well. So all of the facets, all the trouble that you could already encounter with different aspects of your physical life equally can occur with aspects of your virtual reality life. Virtual reality isn't a special new kind of threat. You might wonder about disembodiment. You have this avatar. If there's a special value in inhabiting a realistic human body, you're not quite getting that in VR. That, Chalmers thinks, is just a feature of the current state of our technology and might not always be there. That as VR improves and you get, in particular, better tactile experiences in VR, you could have a very strong sense of embodiment there. Similarly with quality, that if VR experiences are kind of pixely or flat, that's probably just a temporary problem with our technology and not something that's essential to the nature of VR. You might worry that virtual realities are somehow transient. They don't have a long past the way physical reality does, or a huge future. Chalmers grants that the way in which physical reality is entrenched in history is something that gives it value, but he also points out that you can have a lot of valuable experiences in life without reflecting on or engaging with the long history that came before you or the future that extends ahead. Birth and death aren't exactly things you can experience in virtual reality, but there might be some partial counterparts to those experiences. And again, there's a lot of experience which doesn't directly depend on birth and death. Okay, now you might wonder how far this can go. So if Chalmers is going to say virtual reality objects are real, is he also going to say that dream objects are real? He's actually not. He thinks typically you're not cognitively oriented in dreams. You don't have the same kind of agency or action or interaction with dream objects, except in the very rare cases of lucid dreaming. And in particular, dream objects are not mind independent. There's an underlying philosophical framework in this essay. So one way of having a position kind of like Chalmers is to be sort of like Berkeley and think that to be real is to be perceived. There's nothing more to a virtual object or a real object than its redness, its sweetness, its roundness, those tangible qualities. Chalmers is not an idealist. Chalmers is a structural realist. Chalmers thinks reality is characterized fundamentally by its causal structure. There are patterns of interaction between physical objects, and they have certain effects in our experience. And this is what it is for something to be real and to be perceived as real or grasped as real by conscious creatures like us. Structure here is the thing that ultimately matters for reality. And as long as virtual reality is structured, it's not a second-class form of reality. It's just as good as physical reality. Talk about these controversial ideas in class.